Well, we'll begin our conversation tonight with our first witness. Our first witness is an historical witness, one who will establish the racial history surrounding zoning, pollution of polluting industries, and divestment in Black and Brown communities. Our historical witness tonight, Ms. Daisha Williams, will be introduced by none other than Mayor Jennifer Roberts. Jennifer, I turn it over to you. God bless.
I'm Jennifer Roberts, and it is my honor to introduce our historic witness for this episode of the Reimagining America Project. And I am going to be introducing Daisha Williams. She has a Master's of Science in Environmental Policy from the Johns Hopkins University. We discovered we both have masters from there. And she has tremendous expertise in environmental policy and climate and environmental justice. She has been a stormwater specialist and educator. She was a legislative assistant to the Environmental Council in Seattle. She's also worked for a nonprofit that focuses on clean water in vulnerable communities. And she is currently the Environmental Justice Manager for Clean Air NC, which was formerly known as Clean Air Carolina, for those of you who do a lot of environmental work in North Carolina. She is going to give us a brief history of environmental racism and the need for environmental justice in North Carolina and in Charlotte. So Daisha, it's all yours, and you can share your screen with the slides you have. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. And I'm going to show a few slides, and I'll also show them here in a bit. But I appreciate the opportunity to speak today on this very important issue of environmental justice. I'm sure many of you have heard the term in the news due to the major policy push for these issues at our state level and federal level, or you may have heard it come up from attending similar webinars and panels which focus on it. So in this way, environmental justice has become sort of a buzzword, if you will, but it's more than that. It's a concept that rolls in equal protection, equal access, equal enforcement. So it's not a buzzword. It's not a fuzzy issue. It's an issue of the right to live in a neighborhood that's not overpolluted, to live somewhere where your kids can play outside, not next to a refinery or a chemical plant, and without the risk of developing a health condition because of the quality of your environment. And even though it's a concept that's becoming more mainstream, it's something that communities of color have been fighting for generations. And to understand environmental justice and the movement, it's definitely worth looking back at the event that helped launch it in the first place. And I like to bring this up because it was birthed here in our state. So we have sort of an obligation to continue this work. So like I mentioned, communities of color, they have been mobilizing and fighting for years, but the start of the EJ movement, many point to 1982, when North Carolina had announced a plan to move extremely harmful soil contaminated with PCBs from alongside our state's roadsides because it became hazardous. So they decided to move it to a landfill located in Warren County, which at the time and still has a majority Black population. And the decision, it triggered a wave of protests, one of which resulted in the arrest of a US congressman, dozens of faith leaders and other activists who laid in the street to block the trucks from coming into the county. And unfortunately, all this effort that the residents put in, they lost the battle still, unfortunately. And North Carolina buried the PCBs in the county, and it's a decision that still impacts the community today. But the controversy crystallized the idea that the nation's environmental problems are disproportionately burdening its low-income people of color. And so shortly after this, in 1987, the United Church of Christ, through its Commission for Racial Justice, prepared a report called Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, and it provided the concrete evidence that had so far been lacking. So the church's researchers found that race was more strongly correlated with the placement of a hazardous waste facility than any other single factor, and it remained so even when they controlled for income and geographic areas. So from these findings, the church ministers coined the phrase environmental racism. And the UCC did a 20-year update and found that little to no change happened within these trends. And environmental justice advocates and environmental justice communities have shown time and time again that this is no accident. Communities of color, which are often low income, are routinely targeted to host facilities that have negative environmental impacts. So we're talking about landfills, dirty industrial plants, and in North Carolina specifically, a huge concern is that of concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, which bring a host of environmental and health problems to communities in Eastern North Carolina. And within these occurrences, the statistics provide clear evidence of environmental racism, which has stemmed from practices such as redlining that have shaped the experiences of minorities in this country. So for those who may not know about it, redlining began in the mid-20th century, and it was the practice of cities blocking off entire neighborhoods of color in a way that put services out of reach for residents. So government planners in many municipalities, including here in Charlotte, drew redlining maps that identified Black and Latino neighborhoods as undesirable and unworthy of housing loans and investment. And this federal disinvestment, sanctioned by our state and federal agencies from these neighborhoods, meant lower property values, making these communities more attractive to projects like highways and industrial sites that required a lot of cheap land. And these practices were banned under the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but its legacy has remained through fixed segregation, economic inequality, lack of public services to redline communities, as well as one of the main issues I focus on within my work as an environmental justice manager for clean air, which is air quality deterioration from urban highways, industrial plants, landfills, and all of these facilities that I just mentioned. And this trend is relevant across the United States, but just to bring it home here to Mecklenburg County, sorry, is my screen good?
Here you go. Yep, sharing is on.
So just to bring it home, like I said, in Charlotte, much of the West Side has suffered from a history of redlining that kept businesses and loans out of these areas for decades, while making these communities target for highway corridor construction. So if you're from Charlotte, you may have heard of the Crescent and the Wedge, and it represents a persistent pattern which highlights the longstanding pattern of race, income, and wealth that shapes much of the city. So the Wedge is made up of affluent neighborhoods stretching from uptown to South Charlotte and into suburban areas. And then this wedge is surrounded by a crescent of higher poverty neighborhoods to the west and north. And this geographical pattern is due to redlining. So I have these maps here just to illustrate this visually and historically. So Charlotte's 1935 redlining disinvestment map that you see on the far left shows areas in red and yellow where financial institutions did not make home loans or any other kinds of community investments. And you can begin to see what I just explained of Charlotte's poverty crescent created in major part of redlining in the 30s and 40s. And these inequities continue to show up in health disparities. So if you look at the middle map, rates of unemployment, access to fresh and healthy food, from 2012 to 2016 are limited in these neighborhoods. And finally, Charlotte's redlining map on the far right just shows that this practice continues to plague these communities well into 2020 and beyond, where most of our county's poverty falls within these historical areas of disinvestment. So these historical racist practices, like I said, have given rise to many injustices. In an environmental justice community such as West End Charlotte, the concentration of industry, highway traffic, and other activities in the area puts residents at risk for health problems caused by breathing in polluted air. So just as an example, I-85 and I-77, which experiences hundreds of diesel trucks that pass through the area every day, and this is according to our DOT, borders much of the West End. And as you can see from the bottom left map, in addition to this, there's also a quarry that's centrally located in the West End called the Marietta Quarry, which contributes to a host of other air quality issues resulting from quarry activities such as drilling, as well as increased concentration of diesel trucks that are coming in and out of the site. I like to give this example just because I saw this for myself. I went to the Marietta Quarry with a community leader about a month and a half ago. And we were there for about 10 minutes and I counted 36 trucks coming to and from the quarry, diesel trucks. So that's trucks that are just constantly passing through the neighborhoods and contributing to the air quality problem. So these issues build upon each other. It's not just that a quarry is located there, it's the activities that bring people to the quarry that just contributes to these problems. But in general, the historic West End also has a higher concentration of factories, waste sites, and other large emitters of harmful air pollution than anywhere else in our county. And the effects of air pollution are severe. So for low-income communities and communities of color, the dangers of exposure to environmental hazards are exacerbated, because you're combining economic disadvantage, dangerous air pollution, other types of pollutions, and you're putting it in communities that don't have the resources to address the health impact associated with these practices. So these communities find themselves at greater risk for cancer, other health consequences. Many of the things that you see here on this slide are a lot of the health impacts of air pollution. And now as we face the pandemic, poor air quality has become even more of an urgent concern, because many of the health conditions that you see here on this slide have also been shown to increase the risk of death from COVID-19. And we see this reflected in communities that have been hit hardest by COVID. So if you've been following the news, you see that people of color are dying disproportionately from this awful virus compared to their white counterparts. So I'm just gonna stop again just to talk with you face to face. But as you can tell, this is an issue that goes beyond a mainstream buzzword or concept, if you will, like I mentioned at the beginning. And I say this because the age we're living in with social media and all the other platforms have brought these issues to the forefront. And we saw this last summer with the death of George Floyd. Everyone was fired up, and Black Lives Matter became the main topic of conversation on the internet and amongst people. And within this, others were also bringing attention to other areas of racism besides police brutality, and opening up their eyes to the many ways that Black Americans and other Americans of color are treated in this country. And as it died out, and of course, as COVID came, I personally saw less and less about Black Lives Matter and social inequalities. I saw less people trying to learn, and even people expressing that they were tired of hearing about it. But that's a privileged perspective, because even when these concepts fall out of mainstream conversations, it's still a lived in reality for communities of color, and they're constantly fighting against systems that don't support them. So with that, I just want to end this mini hearing testimony to implore you to just continue to fight for this, continue to put this at the forefront. Talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, talk to that person you hear in passing that may say something discriminatory, educate people. And within that, we also have to make sure we're putting pressure on our decision makers to pass and hold the line on environmental justice issues. We have to keep this concept alive so we can keep our communities alive.
Wow, Daisha, I want to thank you for that really powerful presentation. You packed a lot into those minutes, and you remind me of myself. I get talking really fast when I'm excited about something and passionate, and you are truly passionate about it. So thank you so much. We're so lucky to have you as an educator in our community. And I think you answered my second question was going to be, what can any individual do? But I'd like to ask you, what in terms of our policy in Charlotte and in North Carolina, what are a couple of like the top priorities for ways, because one of the things that Reimagining America Project is going to do is to present ideas to policymakers that come out of this testimony and now these hearings. What are some of the priorities, top two priorities or three priorities that our policymakers can do to change the story of environmental racism?
Yeah, that's something really important and something that we should always be focused on, not only just in environmental justice issues, but all issues that impact us as a society, just holding our elected officials accountable. And that's why I think the two questions intercept. So, what can we do as an individual and what can we do with policy? Because our decision makers, they represent us, they represent their constituencies. And, just as far as redlining goes, it's evidence that our institutions have residual racism. And it's a system that favors some members of a community and disfavor others. And just as an example, people who speak the dominant language, people who speak English, people who have the time, people who have the money and the power to contact, or people that have the education to contact a government staff person to, just as an example, get their sidewalks fixed or get their roads repaired or their lights changed first, or address the stormwater impacts or the air quality impacts in their community. Those are the people that get these things fixed, just being there within the decision-making arena and having your voice heard is super, super important, and letting your decision makers know that you're aware of these issues. So, I mentioned the Marietta Quarry and the other various industries that have placed themselves within the historic West End. And when these facilities locate themselves somewhere, they typically have to go through permitting processes, which solicit public input, and it's also based on zoning. So showing up to these permitting hearings, showing up to these zoning hearings, and all these other potential opportunities for public input, it makes the city know that you're paying attention to what is and has played out in our city. And also just contacting other officials that may have a place in this. So urging that local health department to get involved to try and understand more about health impacts in the historic West End, come up with a plan. But yeah, just finding the different ways. And I know that's not as specific, but yeah, just educating yourself and finding those little pockets of public opportunity to just urge your decision makers to really make this at the forefront, because we'll never be successful in our movement for a healthy, safe, and sustainable environment for all of us if we don't intentionally and actively fight to dismantle racism in all of its forms and to speak out for those that have been historically disadvantaged and continue to be disadvantaged by our systems.
Thank you so very much. That was a wonderful testimony. I really wish I could be with Miss Daisha Williams right now just to tell her how great that was, how thorough it was.